Good evening, everyone. It is good to see you again. Again, my name is Brian Stewart. I'm the chair of the Department of Religion and Philosophy here at McMurry University. I want to welcome you again to our third lecture in the series by Bishop Suriel on Coptic-Muslim relations in history. I do also want to make it known to you that these lectures are being live streamed and have been recorded. So if you missed this afternoon's lecture or last evening's lecture, you can access those on YouTube. The best way to find those is probably to go to our departmental webpage. First go to McMurry University's website, mcm.edu, and then search for our department, and it should be right there at the top. 3 links that you can access. You can also go to other social media platforms if you're hip on those kinds of things. Facebook and Twitter should also have those as well. So feel free to pass those along to anybody that missed the lectures and would like to see them. Before we hear our third lecture, please pray with me as we offer this invocation. This is the prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, not so much to be understood as to understand, not so much to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we awake to eternal life. Amen.
It is such a blessing to have His Grace Bishop Suriel with us for these days at McMurry. In a few moments, he'll begin his third lecture, Cooperation or Coexistence, Modern Developments in the 20th and 21st Centuries between Copts and Muslims. At the conclusion of his lecture, he will also respond to some of the questions which have been submitted during the last 2 lectures. I'll mention a few housekeeping items. You can sign up for information from the Abilene Interfaith Council at the table on this side near the door. You can also sign up on this side for notification of future lectures sponsored by the Department of Religion and Philosophy here at McMurry. And if we have any ACU students who are here and would like chapel credit for attending the lecture, there is information for that on the back table also. Again, I'd like to thank the Abilene Interfaith Council for co-sponsoring this event along with the Lilly Fellows program. It has been wonderful to have His Grace Bishop Suriel with us, and I ask you to join me in welcoming him to the podium once again.
Thank you all so much. It's really been a delight to be here over these few days and to meet with many of the students and faculty. It's really been a great delight. So thank you all for your hospitality and for your warmness and for being here tonight in this final lecture. I'm going to answer one question at the beginning. Yesterday, for those that were here or watched online, I spoke about an episode with the Star Wars promotion that was going on in '96 when I was a parish priest in Hawaii and took 3 youth for a Pizza Hut and stood next to the cutout of Darth Vader, life-size, and it was a funny story. But someone asked this question, besides Darth Vader, have you been confused for anyone else? Another religion, Sikh, maybe? No, not another religion, but a few years ago, I was going to get Starbucks, and as I was entering the Starbucks store, there was a seating outside. 2 fellows were sitting out there, and one of them said a comment to me. I didn't quite figure out what he was saying. Maybe I thought he was having a stab at me because of my vestments. And he asked me a question, and then I just basically said no, went and got my coffee, heading back out to my car. And then I said to myself, you know what? I should go back and have a chat with him and see exactly what he wanted to ask me. So I went back to him. I think he got a bit scared seeing me tall with the robes and beard and so on. He stood up, greeted me. I said to him, sir, could you just repeat again what you were asking me as I was entering the store? And he said, yeah, I wanted to ask you if you are a part of the Assassin's Creed. I think many of you know that game, I think that many of the young people play. I didn't know it. But then I explained to him who I was, what church, and so on. Had a bit of a discussion, thanked him, and left. Then when I went back home, I said, I have to find out what's this Assassin's Creed and the characters that are part of this game. And to my surprise, I found one of the characters that maybe some of you know. I forgot what the name was, but if I take my hat off, he's actually dressed very similar to what the Coptic monk is dressed like. So I put both of those photos, my photo dressed like this, with this character, and explained on my Facebook page what had happened with this story. But it was important for me because it's important to reach out to people that are eager to know. And you know, there is, unfortunately, not many people know Coptic clergy and how we dress, so it was good to share that with those 2 young people. So that's the answer to that question. I've been, I guess, confused with other people. I remember once, I think I was in a store somewhere, and this little kid stood in front of me and looked at me in awe and said to me, "Are you God?" So let's get into this third lecture, which has a lot of information in it, but I think hopefully you'll find it interesting because we're going to talk about a lot of interactions between Muslims and particular presidents of Egypt from the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 60s, all the way up to President Sisi. And I actually have some good news at the end to share with you, which I hope you'll find as interesting as I did, that I just got on my Google alerts, something that happened today in Egypt that is really wonderful. So we are now at our final lecture, in which we will dissect Coptic-Muslim relations in the modern era. As with the 2 previous lectures, it is impossible to cover the entirety of interactions between Copts and Muslims in the 20th and 21st centuries. And therefore, this lecture will focus on the eras of President Nasser, President Sadat, President Mubarak, who was there for over 30 years, with a brief discussion of the Arab Spring, and President Sisi. As we delve into this synopsis, I urge you to think about how Egyptian identity has shaped throughout each era, and how this has affected the interactions between Copts, Muslims, and the state. Was there cooperation between Copts and Muslims during this period, or rather coexistence? And maybe I'll leave that question for you to think about. So let's start with the Gamal Abdel Nasser regime. President Gamal Abdel Nasser was declared president of Egypt in 1953 after the Free Office's overthrow of King Farouk and his government, and the creation of the modern-day Republic of Egypt. Nasser was arguably one of the most influential leaders in the modern Middle East, as his policies quickly transformed both Egypt and influenced much of the Arab world. Nasser appealed to the Egyptian people as a populist reformer, promoting pan-Arabism and pushing for the nationalization of public goods. He believed in the concept of Arab socialism, in which he argued the Arab world needs to be united under his economic plan to nationalize their resources as well as gain independent Arab pride. However, despite his influence, Nasser's domestic politics were complicated, contradictory, and oftentimes incredibly messy. One of the most complicated relationships during his reign was between him and the Muslim Brotherhood. As the group initially supported him and his rise to power, he allowed them to continue operating despite banning all other political parties by claiming that they were not a political party. However, he quickly went against the group as they continued to demand to have more influence and power, as Nasser was on his route to consolidate power and gain unilateral authority. Their relationship became hostile, and in 1954, the Brotherhood attempted to assassinate Nasser, which led to the arrest and torture of many Muslim Brotherhood members. As a result, the group was incredibly weakened and went underground. The Coptic question under the Nasser era marks the beginning of modern-day Coptic-Muslim relations. Nasser's friendly relationship, this came a bit later. At first, it was a bit hostile, the relationship between Nasser and the Coptic Patriarch, but then it turned more amicable and more friendly. Nasser's friendly relationship later in his life with Pope Cyril VI became the instrument in which the Copts were able to gather some protections under his regime. One of the most notable moments for the Coptic Church in the Nasser era was the regime's contribution to building a new cathedral to house some of the relics of Saint Mark that had come from the Vatican. Nasser also attended the opening ceremony of the cathedral in 1968, which signaled potential cooperation between Copts and the state. However, despite such shining moments, Nasser's overall policies, both directly and indirectly, influenced the Copts and lowered their status in Egyptian society. Nasser's Arabist policies and his focus on shaping the Egyptian identity as an Arab identity undermined the Egyptianity that Copts found shelter under. Given that Copts do not regard themselves as Arab, having an independent Egyptian identity to a great extent, was one of the many ways that united them and their Muslim compatriots. As Nasser continued to recraft the meaning of being Egyptian, linking it to being Arab, the Copts began to feel excluded from the national narrative. Despite never actively attacking the Copts in public, they did not seem like an integral part of Nasser's plan, and not a component of his, what he called, three circles ideology of Arab, Africa, and Islam. Nasser's socialist policies also destroyed much of the collective economic power as well as political participation of the Copts. The nationalization of big businesses and redistribution of land larger than 200 feddans or 200 acres greatly affected wealthy Copts, and in turn affected their ability to provide charity and to aid to the poor Copts in their areas. Additionally, Coptic political participation saw a drastic decline, as the percentage of Copts in the elections was less than half of 1%. Additionally, Coptic representatives in parliament were also non-existent. To counteract this, Nasser amended the constitution to allow for the presidential appointment of 10 members to the 350-person parliament. However, this was not a long-term political solution to the exclusion of Copts from the Egyptian political system. Many of Nasser's policies were a double-edged sword. An example of this is the nationalization and expansion of the free education system in Egypt, which opened more opportunities for all Egyptians to obtain an education. However, the Nasser regime enforced teaching religion as a mandatory subject in elementary, middle, and high school, despite it being optional previously. In practice, this resulted in all public school students, whether Coptic or Muslim, being required to learn Islam as a core subject, given that most public schools do not offer Christianity as an alternative subject for Christian students. Coptic-Muslim relations during the Nasser era are quite complicated. His friendship with Pope Cyril VI indeed proved to be a helpful factor in maintaining sectarian peace and promoting potential cooperation between Copts and the state. However, Nasser's legacy remains complex. With his policies strengthened some aspects of the Egyptian nation-state, his nationalist and pan-Arabist policies both alienated the Copts by changing the narrative of what it means to be Egyptian, as well as weakened them economically and politically to the point of mere coexistence. So that's the Nasser era. And now we move on to the Sadat regime, which also was complicated. Following the death of Nasser in 1970, Anwar Sadat rose to power as president, forging a very different path for Coptic-Muslim relations in Egypt. Pope Cyril VI died in 1971, which resulted in the enthronement of a new patriarch, Pope Shenouda III, who was patriarch for almost 40 years. Unlike his predecessor, Sadat did not attempt to forge a friendly relationship with the new patriarch, which created a new dynamic between the church and the state. and it was not one based on friendship. The Sadat era marked the exacerbation of hostile relationships between Copts and the state, and the first time in modern history for the church to be publicly attacked in a speech by a sitting president. In order to begin to untangle this era, a bit of historical background as well as larger context is needed, so perhaps we can backtrack a little in order to do so. President Sadat came to power at a very difficult time in Egypt's history, and his reign was filled with both domestic and international complications. To gain legitimacy, once he rose to power, he cooperated with the Muslim Brotherhood, letting them out of prisons as well as the underground operations that they were in under Nasser. He attempted to utilize the group as a counter force to both the liberals and the intellectuals who opposed him, as well as the religious right wing. In order to win the favor of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sadat established the Egyptian identity as an Islamic identity through the addition of the second article of the Constitution in 1971, which states that, quote, Islam is the religion of the state and Arabic is its official language, end of quote. This was later amended in 1980 to include, quote, an Islamic jurisprudence is the principal source of legislation, close quote. Political Islam continued to affect Egypt under Sadat, affecting the education system as well. The rise of the Muslim Brotherhood generated a climate of sectarian tensions and public verbal attacks on Copts. Rumors arose that Pope Shenouda III was attempting to increase the number of Copts and create his own Coptic state. Hostile sentiments and preaching against the Copts increased in mosques run by radical sheikhs, calling for segregation of Copts and Muslims and for Muslims to not partake in business with Copts. The relationship between the church and Sadat was not one of cooperation, as Sadat tried to consolidate more power and control, as well as allowing political Islam to run rampant in the country. Additionally, Copts were almost entirely excluded from the political sphere during Sadat's regime, and the president refused the Pope's request to allocate seats to Copts in the parliament, the judiciary, as diplomats and deans of higher education. The first official confrontation that took place between the church and Sadat was in 1972, surrounding the issue of a church built without a permit, because it was almost impossible at that time to get a permit for a church. The issue of a church built without a permit in El Khanka. This was the first issue of its kind in modern history, in which the police, accompanied by Islamists, destroyed a part of the church as a form of community rejection of the building. Pope Shenouda III ordered the bishops and priests of the area to go pray a mass in the ruins of the church, which Sadat received as an open attack to his power, and quite frankly, a bold reaction. This resulted in a parliamentary investigation, followed by a meeting between Sadat and Pope Shenouda III, which aired live on television. While the president promised the Pope the construction of 55 churches a year without restrictions, they were mere words, as the church was only able to receive permits for a total of 25 churches in the following 4 years, which is a little over 10% of what was promised by the president. Sectarian tensions continued to increase, peaking from 1977 to 1979, as Sheikh Al-Azhar Abdul Halim Mahmoud held a conference in 1977 claiming that any law opposing Islamic law should be nullified and Islamic law should prevail over parliamentary legislation. This was, of course, something very serious for the Copts. Here we see another form of peaceful protest by Pope Shenouda, in which he, alongside the bishops, decided not to celebrate Easter, but went to the monasteries to pray for peace and cooperation. This resulted in Sadat publicly attacking the Pope, and in the process, once again reshaping what it means to be Egyptian. And he said, "I am a Muslim president presiding over a Muslim country." He expressed in a public address to the nation in 1980. This rhetoric shaped Egypt as an Islamic country and being Egyptian as being Muslim. Additionally, it highlighted the claim that the Coptic Church was attempting to establish their own Coptic state, which was never supported by any evidence whatsoever. This was followed by a wave of sectarian attacks on Copts, leading up to the worst attack of its time in a city called El Zawiya El Hamra, a suburb of Cairo, where an argument between neighbors about land for a proposed church turned deadly, with 17 people killed and 54 injured. This event generated much attention in the international world, and Sadat was not well received by Reagan in his visit to the United States shortly after. Additionally, he was confronted with protests by American Copts in front of the White House. Sadat blamed the church and Pope Shenouda III for complaining to the West and orchestrating a hostile reception of him, despite the Pope never doing so. In fact, the Pope's public relations expert, Bishop Suriel, had previously gone to the United States to request from the Coptic community to not protest and provoke Sadat, but unfortunately they did not listen. In fact, the Pope always called for sectarian problems to be solved internally within Egypt. Unable to fire Pope Shenouda III, but wanting to weaken his power, Sadat cancelled the legal decree recognizing the Pope as the head of the Coptic Church and banished him in a monastery surrounding by an army unit with many hundreds of soldiers and tanks surrounding the monastery. I remember those days very well. Ultimately, the Pope was under house arrest. This is the most direct attack on the church that has ever taken place in modern Egypt. Pope Shenouda III refused to take legal action against the state, as he did not want to oppose the country which he loved so dearly, and asserted that he is the head of the church, whether he is in his residence in Cairo or Alexandria, or whether he is in the monastery. So he considered where the Pope is, this is where the seat of the church is. There was a lot of international pressure and conflict that affected Sadat's regime, as well as his relationship with the Copts. Too many to discuss in just a short segment on his era. However, one of the main challenges was the issue of the Israeli state, which ultimately weakened his local support through his signing of Camp David agreement. During the end of his regime, Sadat was unable to contain political Islam. He was assassinated by a small group of young jihadist soldiers during a military parade in 1981. This military parade was commemorating the October 6th war with Israel. Sadat's instrumentalism of political Islam unleashed the beast that was far too powerful for Sadat to contain, which ultimately cost him his life. In addition, his interactions with the church, as well as his Islamization of Egypt, alienated the Copts and left the possibility of cooperation or even coexistence strained after his death. So, a very interesting history. And this leads us to the Mubarak regime. After Sadat's death, Hosni Mubarak, his vice president, took power. However, unlike Sadat, Mubarak had a lot of legitimacy within both the government and the military, and his rise to power was uncontested. Mubarak's era was longer than those of his predecessors, reigning from 1981 until 2011, when he stepped down after growing protests to remove him from office during the Arab Spring. He faced many similar challenges to Sadat. However, Mubarak's main challenge was the Islamization of Egypt, which he inherited from his predecessor, and the growing changes in the country's sectarian relations. The Muslim Brotherhood continued to pose a threat to Mubarak, although never officially challenging his power for much of his regime. His relationship with Pope Shenouda III was warm, unlike his predecessor, and this, however, did not directly translate into a more peaceful time for the Copts. For the sake of time, I will briefly highlight the major turning points in Mubarak's regime in terms of Coptic-Muslim relations, as including all the details of sectarian relations of a 40-year era would take us well over the time available for this lecture. During the beginning of Mubarak's presidency, many Egyptians were hopeful that better times were ahead. He had released over 1,500 people imprisoned by the Sadat regime and relaxed media censorship, as well as repealed many of Sadat's policies that seemed to be overreaching. It is unclear whether he purposefully chose to ignore the rise of political Islam, or whether he simply felt he did not have the capacity to address this issue yet. By the late 1980s, the Muslim Brotherhood was on the rise, and so was their influence. They infiltrated and took over of professional organizations and became very popular as a social welfare group. While Mubarak's primary goal was security, his regime was heavily challenged by the rising sophistication and complexity of Islamic militants and their attacks. Pope Shenouda III returned to his throne, or to his residency in Cairo, in January of 1985, on the eve of the Feast of Nativity of Christmas that we celebrate 7th of January, 4 years after Sadat had banished him. Now that a new president was in office, the relationship between the church and the state was heading towards a more hopeful direction. However, there was a growing attack on Copts in the media, with many Muslim intellectuals, thinkers, and sheikhs openly critical of the church, its leadership, and beliefs. Sheikh al-Azhar at the time, whose name was Ali Gad al-Haq, strained relations further by issuing a fatwa claiming that Jews and Copts were infidels. These attacks resulted in the shunning of Copts away from society, which pushed them more towards the church, where they found a safe space to express themselves and their beliefs. The churches also began providing activities for the youth, such as sports tournaments, meetings, and retreats. As a result of the lack of representation of the Copts, they turned to Pope Shenouda III to represent them to the state. The Pope's active and outspoken personality resulted in rumors and accusations by Islamists, claiming that he was trying to be a politician and that he wanted to use his control over the church to infiltrate the political system. The increasing influence of Islamists greatly affected and changed many Egyptians' daily lives. Many Muslims were dressing in Islamic dress code, which was a new phenomenon in Egypt. Men grew out their beards, and many young women began wearing the hijab and the burqa. This increased use of Islamic dress made the Copts stand out as the other group and resulted in increased segregation and discrimination. The Copts continued to be excluded from the political sphere, and their numbers in government positions were slim to none. However, Pope Shenouda always maintained a positive view and rhetoric when referring to both Egypt and Muslims. He often spoke of the fact that when his mother died, while giving birth to him, both Coptic and Muslim women nursed him. When questioned about his love for Egypt, he responded by saying, "Egypt is not a country we live in, but a country that lives in us." His devotion to Egypt, as well as maintaining peaceful relations with Muslims and the state, was a constant despite growing attacks. Even after his release from house arrest, he began to have a Ramadan iftar dinner for many intellectuals and a wide variety of people in Egyptian society to try to bring peace and love between all Egyptians. During the Mubarak regime, the Copts saw a rise in violent attacks by Islamists. One of the most infamous took place in the village of El-Kosh in the south of Egypt, where a simple dispute between a Copt and a Muslim resulted in the death of 20 Christians and the injury of 20 more, all of them Copts. The charges against the perpetrators disappointed the Copts, as they felt the sentencing of a few years was not equal to the crime that was committed. Many other attacks took place, and the regime's lack of prosecution of perpetrators worried the Copts of the days ahead. Sectarian tensions peaked in 2010 when 3 men opened fire on Coptic worshippers leaving a church in Naga Hamadi, also in the south of Egypt, on January 6, Christmas Eve for the Copts. 15 people were injured or killed. Again, on December 31, New Year's Eve, 2010, Copts were attacked as they were celebrating New Year's Eve. This attack left 23 people dead and over 100 injured. I met one of the people that lost his wife, his 2 daughters, and his sister-in-law. He came to Melbourne, where I was there some years ago, and I just wonder in amazement at this man, how he survives every day in an instant, losing all of his family like that. Attack left 23 people dead and 100 injured. The government claimed that the attack was from Hamas, a Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. No arrests were made, and the government claims the perpetrators were never found. Mubarak's era ended in 2011, when protests during the Arab Spring forced him to step down, as thousands of Egyptians called for change and a democratically elected president. The end of the Mubarak era left Copts at a crossroads. While the Pope had a good relationship with the president, his regime failed to actively protect the Christian community. However, his presidency was a huge improvement over previous presidencies, as Mubarak often portrayed himself as an ally to the Copts. He never attacked the church nor spoke negatively about the Copts or the Pope. Instead, he presented himself as the president of all Egyptians and maintained the separation of church or of Islam and state throughout his policies. In doing so, his rhetoric laid the groundwork for cooperation between Copts and the state, which we are seeing more of in today's Egypt. It was at the end of the Mubarak era that a positive initiative took place named the Egyptian Family House, established in 2011 by the post-revolutionary cabinet of Issam Sharaf. The Egyptian Family House was first conceived by the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar, Ahmed al-Tayyib, and the late Pope Shenouda III of Alexandria. Headquartered in Cairo, the Egyptian Family House consists of Muslim scholars, clerics from the Coptic Church, representatives of various Christian faiths in Egypt, and several Egyptian intellectuals. The Egyptian Family House was able to contribute to the prevention and alleviation of sectarian strife when the resurgence of sectarianism threatened to endanger national unity. The liaison office, headed alternately by the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar and the Coptic Orthodox Patriarch, has built a network of local committees across the country over the past 10 years and has promoted many concrete and effective initiatives. This includes encounters between priests and sheikhs or imams, who often jointly initiated conferences and debates in schools to promote a culture of encounter and peaceful coexistence between pupils of varying faiths. And this now brings us to the period of the Arab Spring and Mohammed Morsi's regime. The Arab Spring gave some Copts hope that better, more inclusive days were ahead. The surge of popular unity that toppled Hosni Mubarak last week has eased tension between Egypt's Muslims and the Coptic Christian minority and raised hopes for lasting harmony, proclaimed headlines in Egypt in light of the Egyptian revolution in 2011. And this, Egypt has been victorious over what they called sectarian strife, proclaimed Muslim preacher Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Here in Tahrir, the Christian and Muslim stood side by side. This cursed strife is no more, he added. His words brought home that intercommunal tensions in Egypt would subside. However, after the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood rose to power through a presidential election, and Mohammed Morsi was declared president. Pope Shenouda's death in 2012 brought extreme sadness to the Copts. He was a very charismatic leader. He was followed by our current patriarch, Pope Tawadros II, and he's the current patriarch till today. The time of the Muslim Brotherhood was incredibly troublesome for Copts, as they saw their fear of the rise of political Islam now has become a reality. The Copts were targeted and attacked by the Muslim Brotherhood, who continued to pattern a pattern of systematic discrimination and violence. Between 2011 and 2013, violent attacks against Copts increased, and many churches were destroyed, leaving hundreds of Copts dead. In July of 2013, Mohammed Morsi was ousted by the people with the support of the military. Hundreds of thousands and even millions went out into the street all over Egypt to protest the Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood government. A month after Morsi's ousting, groups from the Muslim Brotherhood conducted a series of attacks that destroyed over 50 Coptic churches over the span of 4 days. And it is interesting that the Copts did not retaliate after this vicious attack. What did they do? Burn churches, destroyed. They went back into the churches that were destroyed as they were, started praying liturgies, started having wedding ceremonies. Imagine someone's having their wedding day and they come into the church, instead of it being all adorned, this was a sense of the power of the faith of the Copts, and that was their positive reaction to the negativity of the Muslim Brotherhood, that they took a positive stance to go in, to pray, to continue to trust in the Lord, that He would protect His church, as He said, the gates of Hades shall not prevail against His church. The church responded to these attacks with forgiveness, with Pope Tawadros arguing that it was important to protect the nation first and not the churches. He explained that the country was going through a difficult time and the Copts should stay loyal to their country until the situation is resolved and Egypt is more stable. And now we come to the era, our current era, of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is the current president of Egypt. Currently, President Sisi is the head of the government of Egypt, and the Coptic question remains a complicated matter. However, Sisi's government appears to be actively working to promote cooperation between Copts and the state and to mend the Coptic-Muslim relations in the country. Since his election in 2014, Sisi has made numerous friendly gestures towards the Copts. He is the first Egyptian president to have attended Orthodox Christmas liturgical celebrations on more than one occasion, usually almost every year since then, forging a new era of Coptic-Muslim relations and cooperation. Additionally, he has stressed that the Coptic community is an essential and integral part of the Egyptian identity. Sisi's cooperation with the Copts goes beyond friendly gestures and towards policy. In August 2015, the Egyptian parliament approved a new law making it easier to build churches in Egypt. And this did not stop attacks on churches, but it highlighted the support of the state to the Coptic population. Additionally, President Sisi's crackdown on radical Islam has shaped a more inclusive Egypt, affirming in previous statements that preserving the unity of the Egyptian people is the only guarantee to keeping the country safe. And then, just as I was looking at my email before the lecture, today a new announcement by the president, which is unprecedented, and I'm sure is going to bring a lot of joy to Copts, and it's on the national newspaper of Egypt, Ahram. This is what it says, the title: Sisi names first Christian as president of Egypt's Supreme Constitutional Court. This is unprecedented, and never anything like this has happened in the past, and continues to say. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi on Tuesday issued a decree appointing the first Coptic Christian as president of the country's Supreme Constitutional Court. Judge Boulis Fahmi Iskander Boulis. You can't get more of a Coptic name than that. 65 years old, will take over from Saeed Marie Mohammed Gad starting Wednesday, according to the official gazette. Boulis is set to take the oath before the president shortly, and it continues. So this is good news that things now are moving in a positive direction, and we pray that this continues and that peace may prevail over all of Egypt, amongst all of its people, and that the country can begin to move in a positive direction. In conclusion, Coptic-Muslim relations in the modern era have gotten through several waves of exclusion, coexistence, and cooperation, as we saw through the brief discussion of the regimes of the modern era. Each president's personal agenda and view of how they envision Egypt and what it means to be Egyptian has affected their interactions with the Copts. Additionally, we see that the relationship between the patriarch of the Coptic Church and the state is a crucial part of Coptic-Muslim relations in the country. We also see that the rise of political Islam has been the biggest hindrance to peaceful Coptic-Muslim relations. Now, where do we go from here? Well, it appears that Sisi's regime is committed to bettering Coptic-Muslim relations, provided by both the president's narrative when addressing the Copts, as well as his crackdown on radical Islamist ideologies and containing of political Islam. Beyond doing so, the Coptic community is also seeing an attempt for policy change in Egypt, pioneered by the president and his government. This does not suggest that the relationship between Copts and the state and Copts and their Muslim co-patriots are perfect, but it seems that it's moving in that good direction. Note that all the grievances have been mended. What it does suggest, however, is a shift away from the mere coexistence of Copts towards a cooperative relationship between both Copts and the state. This shift is essential in understanding Coptic-Muslim relations in the country and provides an optimistic view for the future. As the Church continues to uphold its values of love and support for Egypt and the government, President Sisi provides a hopeful glimpse of the future in which Coptic-Muslim relations continue to go down a road of unity and cooperation. Thank you for your attention. Do you want me to continue with the question?
Are there questions, Your Grace, you wish to address?
Okay. There are many questions. I probably won't get to go through all of them, and it seems that half of them are from the same person because they're in the same handwriting. So someone is asking, do you speak Coptic, read Coptic? Since Coptic precedes Christ, can you comment on Coptic verses Essene? Christ may have been an Essene. So The Coptic language, as it is today, is made up of all of the Greek alphabet plus 7 letters taken from the ancient Pharaonic hieroglyphic language. So we borrowed a lot of words from the Greek. So I guess what preceded the Coptic was the Pharaonic hieroglyphic language, but what we use in the church today is this alphabet that's made of all the Greek alphabet plus 7 letters from the ancient hieroglyphic. Do I speak Coptic? I don't, but I do read Coptic, and we use Coptic in the liturgical services of the church. Unfortunately, it is no longer a living language that is practiced by Copts in their homes or in daily living. I don't know about this issue of Christ being an Essene, and we know that he was a Jew. What would you say are the current goals of Coptic-Muslim dialogue in Egypt from the perspective of the Coptic Church and from the perspective of Muslim leaders? I think I probably explained a lot of this in this third lecture, and it seems that these dialogues are increasing, and the work of this Egyptian house that is welcoming all people of Egypt, both Christians and Muslims, is beginning to gain a lot of traction, and a lot of positive things are coming out of it, and this would be the perspective, I would imagine, the majority of Muslims and also of Copts. So we hope that this can bring change, and it's good that they are also now going into schools and speaking to students so that they can not only be tolerant of the other or of someone different to their faith, but even to reach further to understand what it means to cooperate together and to have love for each other. Even one person goes to the church and the other goes to the mosque. That does not mean there should be antagonism between these communities. Please explain the history of significance of your robes, hat, and medallion. Okay, let's start with the medallion. This is what bishops wear in all Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches of the Theotokos. Theotokos is a Greek word meaning the mother of God. And it goes back to the time of the Council of Ephesus. And there was a patriarch at the time called Nestorius, the patriarch of Constantinople, and he was teaching heresy and not Christian teaching according to the scriptures. And he would say that who Saint Mary gave birth to was just a mere human, and then divinity was attached to him later. And this is not what we believe as Christians, that Christ at his incarnation was fully human, fully divine at the same time. So since that time, bishops began to wear this icon of the Theotokos to remind us of the nature of Christ and that he is truly divine and truly human at the same time. So that's where this comes from. The robes are monastic robes. They're a story in the life of Saint Anthony the Great, the father of monasticism, that an angel one day appeared to him when he got bored of not knowing how to live his life all day. So the angel appeared to him and showed him, brought palm leaves and told him how to work and to weave the palm trees and the palm leaves, and could make baskets and sell them to make a living. And then at other times he would see the angel standing in prayer. So how to mix his life between work and prayer together, and then gave him this monastic dress, or showed him this monastic dress and this cowl that we wear. And you will notice it has 6 crosses on each side, 12 crosses representing the 12 disciples. Maybe that was not at the time of St. Anthony, probably something added later. And there's a cross at the back that represents the Lord Jesus Christ. And then you'll ask me, what about the stitching in the middle? The stitching represents our struggle in the world against sin and how to live a pure and holy life, because in the life of St. Anthony is a story also that the devil once appeared to him and tore the cowl from his head, and St. Anthony was not disturbed by this, but then took it and stitched it back up and continued to wear it. So this is where all of this tradition came from. What first called you to the church, to join the church? And do you have a favorite lesson of the Bible? And do you have a favorite church you visited? I've been in the church all of my life, since birth, and my parents were devout Coptic Christians. When we migrated to Australia, when I was 4 years old, my brother was 3, in Sydney in 1967, there were no Coptic churches there. And my parents were very concerned how they're going to bring up their children in Australia if there was no Coptic church. And the few families that were there at the time wrote to Pope Carolus VI and asked him to send a priest to care for the small congregation. And that first priest came out in 1969 and established the church, purchased the church the next year. And now that's a very huge diocese and expanded greatly since then. So I grew up in the church basically in Sydney and taught as a Sunday school teacher and also as a youth leader before I decided in 1991 to go back to Egypt to become a monk and live in a 5th century monastery for 5 years out in the desert, very peaceful. I was also assisting as part of the Secretariat of Pope Shenouda III, who had a residence at that monastery and would come every week for retreat for 2 or 3 days. It was a time of contemplation for him, a time for writing, for reading, meeting official guests. So that was a great blessing and inspiration for my life to live so closely and to be so close to Pope Shenouda III. So I have wonderful, wonderful memories of that time, and I miss him very much. Favorite lesson of the Bible, there is many. Just going through the life of Christ and seeing what he did for humanity and being incarnate and the humility that he went through on the hands of those that he created and the suffering that he was willing to go through. During our Passion Week services, we have so many beautiful readings. All throughout the week, some very beautiful hymns that are chanted. We basically spend the whole week in the church and then coming to the crucifixion and then obviously celebrating the feast of the resurrection and the glorious 50 days after this. Our churches, as Christians, are so rich with the teachings of Christ that brings us so much joy. So I wonder if I could put a particular lesson. Do you have a favorite church you visited? I don't know if you mean in Egypt or outside of Egypt. In Egypt, obviously, there is many beautiful churches, and in our monasteries also, and many beautiful frescoes with beautiful iconography. And in Cairo, there is one church of the Virgin Mary in a suburb of Zaytun, where in 1968 she appeared above the domes of that church. And actually the first one to see her was a Muslim, working in the gas station across from the church. The church is built in Basilica style, Italian style. And he saw this woman on the top of the dome, and he started to cry out to her, "Come down, you're going to die." He thought it was an actual woman on the top of the dome. This is a Muslim who doesn't know anything about Christian faith. And then when the priest came and the people began to come, and then they realized that this was actually the Virgin Mary appearing on top of the dome. And in the evening, they even shut off all the electricity from the suburb, and she was shining brightly. And there is some photos of this. And at times, she kneeled in front of the cross on the dome. And we knew that that was going to mean that there were going to be times of sectarian strife for the Copts. And later, as you heard tonight, that Pope Shenouda III was placed on that house arrest and that difficult time that the church went through. But this was an amazing apparition, and many miracles happened. Hundreds of thousands of people saw her, and many miracles of healing took place. So this is a very special church. The gas station was then knocked down later, and a big cathedral was built right across the road from the original Virgin Mary Church. And then outside of Egypt, a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Russia with two of our other bishops from LA, and I saw some stunning churches there and some stunning iconography. I look forward to be able to hopefully go back there. Another one that I really loved was when I visited Venice and went into the Basilica of St. Mark, where actually part of the relics of St. Mark, who founded the Coptic Church, are buried there. And to just see the mosaic work, that all of the iconography in there is mosaic. It's just stunning, and how the artists did all of this. Such a beautiful place. If you haven't had a chance to go there, I would encourage you to visit. It's beautiful. Can you give us some information or perspective on the possible reunification of the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches? This is a good question, because there has been a division since the Council of Chalcedon, the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. And so we've been separated for so long, for 16 centuries or so. But now in the 1960s, a dialogue began between the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Oriental Orthodox. As many of you may know, the Eastern Orthodox churches are in about 14 or 15 jurisdictions: Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, and so on. And on the Oriental Orthodox side, we have 6 churches: the Coptic, the Ethiopian, the Eritrean, the Armenian, the Syrian, and the Indian Orthodox. So there are 2 families of Orthodoxy. So unfortunately, that split happened in Chalcedon, and now a dialogue began, where we began to look at what are the Christological issues. This was the main issue of discussion. And so over many, many years, they would meet regularly. And then in the I think it was 1991, that when the official dialogue came together, they came up with a formula, Christological agreement that both sides agreed to. And they even started to think about how they would lift anathemas. But what was remaining for each jurisdiction to actually accept this official document. But it hasn't happened. The 2 co-leaders of that dialogue, unfortunately, now have passed away. It seems to be at a stagnant stage, and not much we have heard about the dialogue continuing. But we always have to have hope and continue to see, because I don't think in our day and age we can continue to be separated like this. And I hope that one day both the Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches can reunite together again to be the one Orthodox Church. Someone is saying, Jesus said, "One will follow me that will take from that which is mine. He will tell what he is told." The writing is a bit difficult. Is this a prediction of Muhammad? No, not at all. This was speaking about that the Lord was going to send the Holy Spirit. But sometimes some Islamic scholars try to put that twist on it, but the language is just not there. And then someone is saying the Coptic Christians were Gnostics. No, we weren't. There's been Gnostic texts written in Coptic, like the Naga Hammadi codices, but these were heretical texts. They were never approved by the church nor by any ecumenical councils. So the Coptic Orthodox Church today, over 2,000 years, has not been a Gnostic church and only relying on personal knowledge of God. Never. Can you fill us in on the Coptic community in the US? Numbers, how it's going with the second generation, locations, etc. It's a good question. At the time of beginning of the reign of Pope Shenouda III, and just a little bit before that, Pope Carolus VI, there were no Coptic churches either. I think there was one church established in New Jersey, and another church in Los Angeles, and maybe one in the Toronto area. That was about it in North America. But many Copts began to migrate for different reasons. Some was economic, which was, they wanted to have a better life for themselves and the future of their children. And some of it was because of the sectarian strife that was going on in Egypt at the time. And there was many different groups of Copts coming at different times. Started off in the 60s, and then more came in the 1970s. After the revolution, another great influx came, and they spread all over of North America, but let us concentrate on the US. So there is many churches being established in New Jersey, in New York, in Boston area. In Texas here, there is a large diocese. It's probably one of the largest dioceses in America, because the bishop there, when he was ordained in 1995, I think, there was only scattered numbers of churches in the southern states. So Pope Shenouda appointed him from Florida all the way to Arizona, 11 states that he's responsible for. He was known as the Flying Bishop because he was basically living out of a suitcase. Every week he was in a flight going to a different state, different city to look after the people, and more people were coming. And then suddenly, Copts that were in New Jersey and couldn't find jobs, some Copts had gone to Nashville in Tennessee and were beginning to be employed in some hotels there. And the hotel was thriving and growing and wanted more workers that they couldn't find. So the Copts that were working there began to contact their friends and relatives in New Jersey, and they began flooding into Nashville, Tennessee, that now I think has about 8 churches with about 10,000 Coptic families living there. It's almost like, a small suburb of Cairo called Shobra. You can see Copts with the names of their businesses in Arabic and so on, which was very interesting. In Los Angeles, where I serve, under Metropolitan Serapion, and we have 2 other bishops assisting there, That diocese has grown. All of the southern of California and Hawaii is part of that diocese. Now has about 50 churches, about 100 priests and deacons serving there, and we can't keep up ordinations. So last year there may have been at least 6 or 7, maybe more priests and deacons were ordained. We had the ordination just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, another one at the end of February. And as the congregation grows and the needs are growing, we need to be able to serve these communities to the best of our ability. So now, so many dioceses have been set up in America. So we have the Diocese of Los Angeles under Metropolitan Serapion, the Diocese of the Southern States. We have a diocese in Detroit. We have a diocese in New York. And we have a diocese in Cleveland. And there's still probably a few more dioceses that need to be established. And so some of these bishops, as their diocese grew, it was becoming very difficult for them to cover all of this ministry on their own. So that is why Metropolitan Serapion in LA decided to appoint 2 bishops there that were ordained in Cairo, Bishop Abraham and Bishop Krolos, and they do really great ministry, and now I'm assisting them. And he has established departments for them. So Bishop Abraham, for example, heads the department of the diaconia, so looking after social ministry, ministry to the elderly, setting up a clinic for those that are suffering from drugs and things like this, serving Arabic youth, and much work in this field. And then Bishop Krolos heads up the Department of Education, looking after religious education and theological education. Bishop Yusuf, 11 states, getting very difficult for him to cover all this region, has also now 2 other bishops assisting him. One, I believe, in Texas, one in Florida, because that's also many, many churches that have been established there. With consideration to the 2nd and 3rd and maybe 4th generation now, that we have a vibrant youth ministry in our church. So you'll find youth conventions during the summer and other different times of the year, and also youth groups that are active in each parish, where they have spiritual services for them and also social activities. I'm currently establishing a monthly youth meeting for young adults 18 to 24 in the Riverside and San Bernardino counties, and then we're going to replicate this meeting in the other counties of the diocese in the near future. So yes, I think we have been careful to care for our youth and our young people. It's not an easy ministry, but we try to present to them the Word of God in a practical way, in a spiritual way. Priests are always there for the young people to take their confession, to help them with any problems that they have, and our priests are always available, either for the congregation or for the youth. So I might stop there, because I know it's been a long evening for you, but I am deeply indebted to McMurry University, to Father Philip, to the faculty, to the Abilene Interfaith, and to the Lilly Foundation for preparing these lectures. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here. I thank all of you for coming and attending, and I hope it has been of some benefit and has given you some insights of what has been happening in the Coptic Church and its interactions with the Muslim community for the past 14 centuries. Thank you very much.
Your Grace, we thank you profoundly for these wonderful lectures. You have broadened and deepened the understanding of the Christian faith in Egypt, of the relationship between Egyptian Christians and Muslims. And you have enriched and challenged us spiritually, both in your lectures as well as in your meeting with students. We are very grateful to you for being with us. It has been a great blessing, and we thank you once again. And thanks to everyone for coming out this evening. And I'll remind you, if you would like to be informed of future lectures in religion here at McMurry, sign up on the list as you leave, and also do the same with the Abilene Interfaith Council. Have a good evening.